Antiochus's reign was so full of indignities that the Holy Book calls him root of sins, because during his days all unrest and wickedness began which befell the Jewish people. This is a passage from the Gyðinga Saga, the Saga of the Jews. It was composed in Iceland during a warring states period in the mid-13th century, a time when the power of the Norwegian crown and the Catholic Church were sufficiently weakened that learned men had unprecedented freedom to add to the corpus of knowledge in Old Norse. The Gyðinga Saga, covering the Hasmonean and Herodian periods of Jewish history, was either mostly or entirely written by a Catholic bishop, Brandur Jonsson, and thus you might assume that it was written for religious purposes, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Only one part of a series of ancient histories, the Gyðinga Saga borrows liberally from Jewish, Christian, and pagan sources, and is altogether remarkably non-judgmental, making Bishop Jonsson the first Jewish historian in the Nordic world. This is all the more surprising in light of the fact that this was centuries before the existence of any Jewish community so far north. A disclaimer: this video is called Judaism in Scandinavia, but it will cover all of the Nordic countries. Scandinavia just looks and sounds better, and people will be more likely to understand the premise of the video. Prior to the early modern period, contact between Scandinavia and the Jewish world was rare and very qualified. Certainly there was lots of contact between them in Western Europe and the Mediterranean in the form of Viking raids, but insofar as these encounters are documented at all, they're scarce, short, and questionably objective, such as the annalist Bertiniani blaming the local Jewish population for somehow inciting a Viking raid on Bordeaux. Surprisingly, the first record of Jewish contact in Scandinavia comes from a Jewish source rather than a Scandinavian one. In 965, Spanish explorer Ibrahim ibn Yaqub wrote observations of his travels through the city of Schleswig, giving us a rare contemporary look at Danish society just before the kingdom adopted Christianity. Now, Schleswig is now part of Germany, but at the time it was predominantly Danish, and as it turned out, this part of Germany would continue to serve as a gateway between the Jewish people and Scandinavia. In 1536, Denmark adopted Lutheranism as the state religion, and with that banned all non-members from living in the country, even other types of Protestants. But this is something the Danish crown would slowly scale back in the century to follow. Towards the end of the 16th century, crypto-Jewish refugees from Portugal were establishing themselves in the major port cities of Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Hamburg, London, and Livorno. These cities, renowned for their tolerance, were also becoming immensely wealthy, and Denmark was eager to emulate their example. In 1616, King Christian IV established the city of Glückstadt on the Elbe in an attempt to compete with nearby Hamburg. 3 years later, he granted safe passage to a Jewish merchant named Albert Dionisch, and in 1630 he granted a dispensation for Jews to settle in the city permanently. One of these was the doctor and rabbi Benjamin Musafia, who went on to become court physician and tended to the king in his mad final years. Following the king's death, Musafia moved back to Amsterdam to continue his work as a rabbi, only for his son-in-law to arrive in Denmark a couple decades later. Gabriel Milan first entered the Danish orbit in 1670, when he was appointed as Denmark's factor general in Amsterdam. In 1682, King Christian V allowed all non-Lutherans, including Jews, to live in Copenhagen, and 2 years later Milan was appointed governor of the Danish West Indies. Milan is sometimes claimed as the first Jewish head of government in the modern world, but this is untrue. In reality, he'd converted to Christianity upon his second marriage back in 1675. Otherwise, he would never have been considered for the job. Upon taking office, he attempted to rule the island of St. Thomas as his personal kingdom, imprisoning his fellow officials, engaging in piracy both with and against the colonists, and variously murdering or dismembering African slaves. For this, he was quickly removed as governor and later executed. That isn't to say that the Danish West Indies didn't have a Jewish population. Indeed, the island of St. Croix was home to one of the Caribbean's earliest Jewish communities, but that's a different island to be discussed at a different time. Entering the 18th century, the Danish government's attitude towards Jews remained one of intense regulation and suspicion. From the very beginning, Jewish immigration into the country was restricted to those with a minimum wealth quota and included a special entry fee. In 1728, the Church of Denmark even proposed mandatory church attendance in order to pressure Jewish residents to convert. though this was never implemented, probably because the same policy was already in place in the Papal States and the Church was probably keen to avoid comparison with the Vatican. Nevertheless, Jews were beginning to make their mark on the kingdom. In 1719, the first synagogue was established in Frederica, and in the 1720s, playwright Ludwig Holberg wrote 5 satires that included send-ups of Danish Jews, who at this time apparently spoke a pidgin of Danish and Low German. The characters were all basically stereotypes, but taking care to include them at all was actually pretty progressive. Building on that foundation, Holberg later published the first Jewish history in Danish, in which he spoke out against discriminatory anti-Jewish laws across Europe. But by this time, Denmark no longer had a monopoly on Scandinavian Jewry. Ever since the breakup of the Kalmar Union in 1523, the Swedish crown had enjoyed contacts with and occasional visits by Jewish merchants, intellectuals, and diplomats. And following their victory in the 30 Years' War, Sweden was rewarded with a number of territories in northern Germany with existing Jewish populations, some of them even entering service to the Swedish crown. In the 1650s, Queen Christina was noted for her positivity towards Jews and became a friend of the Anglo-Jewish rabbi and printer Manuel Diaz Soero, while in the following decade, the government of King Carl XI hired the Jewish sailor Henrik Atzeveda to negotiate for an end to the kidnapping of Swedish sailors by the Barbary pirates. Despite these warm relations, attempts to legalize Jewish settlement in Sweden proper were roundly rejected, culminating in 1685 when King Carl XI issued an official ban on Jewish residents. However, that ban would be short-lived due to the Great Northern War. To keep this as brief as possible, the Great Northern War happened when Russia, Poland, and Denmark declared war on Sweden in the belief that its young king, Karl XII, was an inexperienced hothead who could easily be defeated. They were wrong. Sort of. Initially, Sweden won. However, rather than accept victory, Karl continued fighting for years until the Swedish army was laid low and forced into exile in the Moldavian town of Bender. Over the next 5 years, Karl and his entourage basically turned Bender into a Swedish colony, eventually taking on 300,000 riksdaler in debt from local Jewish, Turkish, and Armenian merchants. When the absentee Karl was finally recalled to rule the country he'd supposedly been fighting for, those creditors came back with him in order to make sure that the debt was repaid. For most of the 18th century, Jews in Sweden were only permitted to live in small towns and had virtually no legal rights. But things finally began to change in the 1770s, during the reign of King Gustav III, who sought to model himself on the enlightened absolutism of Prussia's Frederick the Great, and accordingly was somewhat sympathetic to Moses Mendelssohn's ideas of Jewish emancipation. In 1775, Gustav established a free port at the city of Marstrand, which enjoyed total religious freedom and became a haven for Jewish immigrants, mostly from Hamburg. Part of the city's old fortress was even converted into Sweden's first dedicated synagogue. The same year, Gustav granted special protections to Aron Isak, a seal engraver who'd worked for the Swedish army during the 7 Years' War, to live in Stockholm with full citizenship rights, the first such instance in Swedish history, though several more soon followed. Though he ruled as an absolutist, Gustav III couldn't have advanced the rights of Swedish Jews on his own. As much, if not more credit, is due to the Finnish priest, politician, and economist Anders Chydenius, who in 1782 worked with Aron Isak to push forward legislation expanding Jewish rights. In addition to Marstrand, Jews received the right to live and work in the cities of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Norrköping. However, they were only allowed to live and work in these cities. As in Denmark, their residency was contingent on a minimum wealth threshold. They were still banned from voting and from owning property without a royal license, and obtaining the civil rights permitted would require a license fee of its own. Most of these restrictions came at the behest of Christian business owners, who felt that their Jewish competitors' aversion to binge drinking put them at an unfair advantage, and somehow also put them at a higher risk of criminal behavior necessitating strict supervision by local police. This wasn't the situation Chydenius and Isak had hoped for. In fact, it was far more restrictive than the existing status of Jews in Marstrand, whose free port status would soon be abolished anyway. But in spirit, it was at least a step forward. A similar sea change was going on back in Denmark. By this time, Jewish emancipation was beginning to take effect in the United States and most of the Habsburg realms, and would soon spread across Western Europe with the French Revolution. Denmark, facing increasing public pressure and always eager to regain some of its former influence, began taking some conservative steps in the same direction. Starting in 1788, Jews were allowed to join trade guilds, though the guilds themselves could still refuse. In 1798, they were allowed to attend the University of Copenhagen, and in 1802, they were finally allowed to own property. This shift was further accelerated during the Napoleonic Wars. Leaving aside the various client states established by Napoleon and his family, Denmark was the French Empire's most reliable ally, fighting alongside the emperor from 1807 to 1814. Napoleon, of course, had gone to great lengths to establish a legal standard for Jewish citizens in modern Europe, and Denmark quickly followed suit with a series of decrees allowing the establishment of Jewish schools, enabling Jews to live anywhere in the country and serve in the military, culminating in 1814 with a royal decree granting Jews almost all the same rights as Danish citizens. Danish Jews even got a new name. Under Napoleon, the term Jew had come to be seen as derogatory, so in most of Europe, and even the US for the better part of a century, the term was replaced by Israelite or Hebrew, or in this case, Mosaic. One place where this didn't happen was the British Empire, which is why Jewish ultimately prevailed in English. So from 1814 to 2014, Denmark's Jewish religious administration was officially known as the Mosaic Faith Community. This wasn't complete emancipation. All Jewish citizens were still uniquely required to swear an oath of loyalty to the king, but it's remarkable that these rights persevered even after Napoleon's defeat and 2 waves of anti-Semitic violence in the kingdom. Curiously, the situation couldn't have been more different in Norway. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, Norway had been in a personal union with Denmark. But in the 1680s, while King Christian V was allowing Jews to settle in Denmark, he was simultaneously banning them from even setting foot in Norway. With Denmark's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, Norway briefly declared independence before being awarded to Sweden, during which time a new liberal constitution was implemented which nevertheless doubled down on the Jewish ban. But by the middle of the century, the most virulent opposition to emancipation had greatly declined across Scandinavia. In Denmark, the Jewish presence was rapidly becoming normalized, only facing serious opposition in the city of Aarhus. By 1807, Swedish authorities had to admit that their Jewish subjects' lack of alcoholism and justifiable fear of mob violence at the slightest provocation made them less likely to engage in criminal behavior, not more, bringing the harsh regulations of 1782 into question. In 1838, they were replaced by a new series of regulations enabling freedom of movement, residency, and business. As in Denmark, the term Jew was eliminated in favor of Mosaic, establishing that Swedish Jews were incontrovertibly Swedish subjects. Unlike in Denmark, they still weren't citizens, and thus had no right to vote or hold public office. Indeed, Sweden's historic opposition to Napoleon and to Denmark had engendered a much more durable form of anti-Semitism. Accordingly, the new regulations of 1838 were met by a series of riots targeting the country's 850 Jews. The government didn't give in, and by 1847 there was majority support in the Riksdag to emancipate Jews entirely. However, repeated attempts at emancipation continued to be opposed by representatives of the peasantry, whose approval was necessary for emancipation to become law. Likewise, Jewish emancipation enjoyed majority support in the Norwegian Storting as early as 1842, but still lacked the 2/3 supermajority needed to amend the constitution. This sectoral opposition began to decline during the revolutions of 1848, as Jewish emancipation became bound up in much broader principles of human rights, citizenship, and political enfranchisement. Probably the most dramatic example of this was in Italy, where Jewish emancipation actually became a central tenet of the nationalist cause. But this shift in public attitudes was certainly felt in Scandinavia as well. In 1849, Danish King Frederick VII eagerly renounced absolutism in order to break the power of the aristocracy, leading to a new constitution which established full Jewish emancipation. 2 years later, the Storting emancipated Jews in Norway. But as you might expect, emancipation in Sweden took a lot longer. Over the course of the 1860s, Jews were enabled to participate in municipal elections, to be employed by the national government, and to vote in national elections. Finally, in 1870, the Riksdag opened its doors to Jewish deputies, with Aron Philipsson serving as the very first in 1873. But as I've said many times on this channel, There's no intrinsic correlation between political rights and social acceptance. And with Jewish emancipation now universally implemented across Scandinavia, the fortunes of its Jewish population diverged radically across national borders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The emancipation of Denmark's Jews marked the beginning of a golden age. A century after Ludwig Holberg used satire to humanize Danish Jews, he found a worthy successor in the Jewish satirist Meir Aron Goldschmidt. Towards the end of the century, 3 Jewish brothers became leading voices in their respective fields: literary critic Georg Brandes, economist Ernst Brandes, and politician Edward Brandes, the latter of whom oversaw the sale of the Danish West Indies to the United States in 1917. Did I mention that Denmark's Jewish population throughout this period was only around 4,000? Sweden's Jewish population was even smaller, yet it experienced a similar explosion of Jewish cultural contributions, particularly in the fields of art and music. Norway ended up as the odd kingdom out, as emancipation predated the existence of a Jewish community there. By the end of the 19th century, communities had been established in Oslo and Trondheim, but despite fear-mongering that amending the constitution would lead to a Jewish invasion, the number of Jewish immigrants was consistently in the single digits per year. By the outbreak of the First World War, the Jewish population was barely over 1,000, mostly fueled by the ongoing mass exodus from the Russian Empire, of which immigrants to Norway comprised about 0.1%. Nevertheless, the outbreak of World War I led to a massive resurgence in Norwegian anti-Semitism. Having only gained independence from Sweden a decade earlier, a certain sector of Norwegian society was seized by ultranationalist mysticism. Drawing particular inspiration from Theodor Fritzsche's conception of German nationhood as an existential battle between Aryans and Semites. Starting in 1916, much of Fritzsche's writings were republished by Norwegian writers in their magazine The National Journal. Following the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, it was standard practice for Norwegian Jews to be profiled as suspected Bolshevik agents, culminating with a 1929 law requiring animals to be stunned before slaughter, which is prohibited under Orthodox interpretation of kashrut. This wasn't an explicit ban on kosher slaughter, but the issue was explicitly raised by anti-Semitic politicians in the Ministry of Agriculture who sought to weaponize the wider movement against animal cruelty. And unlike prohibition in the US, which arose from a similar alliance of bigots and naive do-gooders, this law provided no religious exemptions. In Denmark, meanwhile, the period between 1910 and 1930 should probably be regarded as the Danish Jewish Golden Age. Denmark had been a major point of transit for Jewish refugees fleeing the Russian Empire and the subsequent Russian Civil War, and when the United States began severely limiting immigration from the Old World, over 1,000 such refugees chose to stay in Denmark permanently. In a cultural shift that might sound familiar to Americans who lived through the 1960s and 70s, playwright Henry Nattensson produced a series of works that directly confronted the Danish Jewish experience, highlighting both the tension and the harmony between ethnic and national identity, and even recast past Danish Jewish luminaries so as to highlight their Jewishness rather than dismiss it as trivia. Nattensson's work dealt heavily with issues of conflicting pressures between assimilation and Jewish pride, which would have resonated especially strongly with one of his contemporaries, the most famous Scandinavian Jew who has ever lived. In 1905, file clerk and part-time PhD candidate Albert Einstein produced a whopping 4 scientific papers which shattered the conventional understanding of physics established by Isaac Newton 2 centuries earlier, creating a new framework with which to make sense of recent discoveries and catapulting him to a lifetime of fame. I'm not going to get too deep into this since we'll probably come back to it in a future video, but basically Einstein's formulas demonstrated that the universe was a much stranger and more complicated place than most people had been willing to accept. Yet less than a decade later, Niels Bohr, the Danish son of a Jewish mother and Lutheran father, revealed a universe that was too complicated even for Einstein. After working with physicists in Britain, Bohr produced a new model of the structure of the atom, which is probably the one you learned about in high school physics, though it's purely a symbolic depiction. Much as Einstein created a framework for experiments that preceded him, Bohr's work created a framework for the emerging discipline of quantum mechanics, for which he received the 1922 Nobel Prize in Physics, though his work was far from over and would prove indispensable in the decades to come. Before continuing, I want to note that this video is sponsored by OmniAtlas, but not in the way you might think. I've been working behind the scenes with OmniAtlas since 2013, and the regional maps and map templates you see on my channel are all thanks to them. OmniAtlas is a crowd-supported historical atlas that shows not only official borders of recognized nations, but insurgencies, occupying armies, and other forms of influence and control between polities. And OmniAtlas patrons can get early access and vote on what series get produced next, so check out their link in the description. It should go without saying that no period in Scandinavian Jewish history was more transformative than the rise of the Nazis and the subsequent Second World War, but f*** it, we have to start somewhere. In Denmark, German political refugees were given safe haven, and this included some Jewish figures, but being Jewish alone wasn't considered sufficient for a visa. At the same time, however, King Christian X defied his advisors and attended the centennial of the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen, becoming the first Scandinavian ruler ever to visit a Jewish place of worship. The visa situation was much the same in Sweden and Norway, if not worse. Following the Anschluss in 1938, all of the Nordic countries, save Finland, flatly banned Austrian Jews from taking refuge within their borders. In Norway, fewer than 1,000 Jewish refugees were accepted through the Nansen Relief Organization. And Iceland, whose tiny Jewish population was composed entirely of recently arrived refugees, took quick action to expel them to continental Europe shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. Bizarrely, the antipathy toward Jewish refugees in these countries was driven just as much by opposition to Nazism as support for it. By the late 1930s, virtually every country in Europe had some kind of fascist movement, but Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Icelandic fascists were unusual in explicitly aligning themselves with Nazism despite not being German. Though this makes some sense given the Nazis' fixation with all things Nordic, whether real or imagined. However, all of these parties remained on the fringe of national politics. Only the Danish Nazi Party ever won seats in a national election. And much as they agitated against allowing Jewish refugees in the spirit of anti-Semitism, more mainstream politicians were hesitant to allow Jewish refugees for fear that their presence would fuel the rise of Scandinavian Nazism. By 1938, it was clear to all of Europe that Germany would soon plunge the continent into war. By keeping their Nazi movements at bay, Scandinavian governments believed that they could keep themselves out of that war. They were wrong. In April 1940, 6 months after completing the invasion of Poland, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark and Norway with the intent of seizing Norwegian ports and controlling access to Swedish iron ore. Having surrendered just 6 hours into the invasion, Denmark was treated to a comparatively lenient occupation. Germany even refused to assist a pro-Nazi coup attempt that November. No such forgiveness was shown to Norway. Where the Western Allies were quick to lend support, the invasion took nearly twice as long as in Poland, and a ferocious resistance movement took root behind the German lines. With the king and civilian government taking refuge in London, the Germans handed civil authority to former defense minister Vidkun Quisling and the National Gathering, a fascist party that had never held seats in the Storting. Action against Norway's Jewish population was swift. As early as May 1940, the occupying Germans began confiscating radios from Jewish homes, Jews were banned from practicing law or medicine, and Jewish businesses were systematically vandalized and looted by National Gathering paramilitaries. In early 1941, Jewish passports were marked by the government as part of a comprehensive registry, and in March 1942, the Quisling government restored the Jewish clause of the 1814 Constitution. From there, the situation rapidly escalated. That October, a border patrol officer killed a pro-German police officer while attempting to sneak 9 Norwegian Jews to safety in Sweden, which the Quisling government used as justification to commence the registration, arrest, and deportation of almost anyone found in Norway with at least one Jewish-born grandparent or affiliation with the Jewish consistory. Now, for all I've said about Norway as a beacon of anti-Semitic writing and thought among the Nordic countries, these attitudes weren't shared by the majority of citizens. The Quisling government was aware of this and made numerous efforts to make the escalating hostility towards Norwegian Jews to be as visually discreet as possible. And when their efforts became too egregious to hide, the anti-Semitic publishing industry that had flourished since the First World War stepped up in an effort to turn the population against the Jewish minority. Instead, it had the opposite effect, radicalizing an ever greater share of the Norwegian people to take action against the Quisling government, including the assistance of Norwegian Jews. Altogether, about 1,300 Jews were able to escape to Sweden. But for many, it was too late. About 770 of Norway's Jews had been deported to concentration camps in Europe, mostly Auschwitz, of whom only 26 survived the war. An additional 23 were killed in Norway. By this time, the war had turned in favor of the Allies on nearly every front. To the east, the Germans were reeling from the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. And in July, the Western Allies landed on Sicily, reopening the war in the West. In Denmark, it was beginning to dawn on both the public and the political establishment that Germany was going to lose the war, leading to general strikes and increasingly bold and violent resistance actions. This culminated on the 29th of August, when the entire Danish government resigned in protest and had the entire navy scuttled to prevent the Germans from seizing it. The Germans, in turn, declared martial law, sent in a wave of SS and Gestapo to assume control over the country, and immediately began plans, as had been carried out in Norway, to liquidate all persons in Denmark with at least one Jewish-born grandparent. The SS and Gestapo planned to carry out a mass arrest and deportation on the 1st of October, which happened to be Rosh Hashanah, the Hebrew New Year. But when the arrests began, most of Denmark's Jewish population was nowhere to be found. 3 days earlier, the German ambassador had leaked plans for the arrest to the country's rabbis, the bishops of the Church of Denmark, and politicians from almost every party, who soon received an offer of asylum from neutral Sweden. Of the 7,800 or so Danish Jews sought after by the Nazis, 7,220 were able to escape to Sweden. This included Henry Natansen, who committed suicide soon after, and Niels Bohr, who was quickly smuggled to Britain and then America with news of the German program to create an atomic bomb. An additional 464 Danish Jews were held at Theresienstadt, a Potemkin village created by Germany for a propaganda film to hide the true nature of the Holocaust from the International Red Cross. Of those sent to Theresienstadt, only the Danish deportees weren't sent to Auschwitz, courtesy of intervention by King Christian X. Now, it's estimated that about 1.5 million Jewish military personnel from at least 18 countries participated in the Second World War. What's interesting about this number is that it's only slightly more than the total number of Jewish personnel in the First World War, despite the fact that the world's Jewish population had increased significantly since then and that more countries were involved. This is partly because the numbers only include regular forces and uniformed partisans, not resistance members. But the bigger reason should be obvious. In World War I, both sides enlisted Jewish personnel in large numbers, whereas in World War II, they were only fighting for the Allies. Right? Among the Nordic countries, Finland represents an entirely different side of Jewish history. Where the Jewish communities of Scandinavia could trace their folkways to Western cities like Hamburg and Amsterdam, Finnish Jewry originated from that country's time as a subject of the Russian Empire, which, yes, means that Finland is east of the Mendelssohn line. Aside from a handful of merchants in Hamina and Helsinki, Finland's Jewish community only began to take shape in the mid-19th century. Between 1827 and 1857, the Russian crown operated the Cantonist system, part of the wider policy of Russification, by which the government attempted to forcibly assimilate Jews by drafting them as child soldiers for 12 years and attempting to torture them into converting. Sometimes this worked, but most of the time it didn't. And following Russia's humiliating defeat in the Crimean War, Emperor Alexander II abolished the Cantonist program and shortened military service from 12 years to 6, which resulted in a modest population of so-called useful Jew veterans who enjoyed the conditional privilege of living outside the Pale of Settlement reserved for most of the empire's Jews. While most Jewish veterans and their families settled in places like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Siberia, a small number ended up in Finland, which until 1899 was still officially a separate state in personal union with the Russian emperor. Discussion around emancipation began in 1872, but didn't get very far due to opposition from the merchant class. Hopes of emancipation further diminished as Russia began to exercise greater control over the territory, culminating in full annexation. But following the Russian revolutions of 1917, Finland declared independence and officially enacted Jewish emancipation. The interwar period thus saw an explosion of Finnish Jewish culture, mostly speaking a unique mix of Swedish and Yiddish, and particularly excelling in the fields of sports, music, and film. Trying to fit Nordic Jewish history into one video may have been a mistake. But to go back to the start of this digression, Finland's experience of the Second World War was famously unusual. The war began in 1939 when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to partition much of Central Europe between themselves. From the Soviet perspective, that included taking Finland. And since the Soviets were technically co-belligerents with Germany, Finland's defense against Soviet aggression was actively supported by the Western Allies. But when Germany turned against the Soviets 2 years later, Stalin and company used this as an excuse to resume their attempted conquests, thus bringing Finland into an alliance of convenience with the Nazis. Finland's government had no illusions about the uncomfortable position this put them in, and even more so its Jewish population, 20% of whom were in the armed forces. Most Finnish citizens and politicians had little love for their German advisors. Through those advisors, Jewish Finnish officers had unique insights into the horrors unfolding to their south. This relationship made Jewish officers frequent targets of Nazi sympathizers in Finnish law enforcement. And true to form, in November 1942, the Finnish government, though refusing to turn against their own Jewish population, agreed to hand over 200 Austrian Jewish refugees to the SS. Of those 200, 8 were ultimately deported to Auschwitz, of whom only 1 survived. For the most part, Jewish servicemen in Finland resigned themselves to the fact that they were fighting foremost for Finland, an attitude which culminated in the nomination of 3 Jewish service members for the Iron Cross, though all of them refused. Luckily for these men and women, Finland's failure to restore their pre-war borders resulted in them switching sides once more, driving the German presence out of their country while quietly welcoming Soviet Jewish prisoners of war who discreetly took the opportunity to flee Russia for good. By the end of the war, the Holocaust had claimed the lives of 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. But thanks to the efforts of politicians, community leaders, resistance members, and ordinary citizens, those claimed from the Nordic countries numbered fewer than 1,000. Following their escape to Sweden, many Danish Jews had joined a military force in exile, which participated in the purge of pro-Nazi insurgents during the liberation of Copenhagen. Many of them brought their organizational experience to the Israeli War of Independence, joined by many of the aforementioned Finnish veterans, escaped Soviet prisoners, and almost no Swedish Jews. Following its liberation just before the war's end, Norway, which had been one of the first countries in Europe to abolish the death penalty for civilians, temporarily reinstated it in order to execute Quisling and 39 other high-ranking collaborators, in addition to convicting several thousand others, including many of the original Norwegian Volkists from the First World War. Before the war, Sweden had already overtaken Denmark as home to the largest Jewish population among the Nordic countries, and the war only hastened that increase due to refugees from Denmark and Norway. After the war, most of those refugees either returned home or emigrated elsewhere, but a lot of them stayed, suddenly making Sweden home to the majority of Nordic Jews. Inspired in part by their experience of the war, Sweden adopted a policy of welcome for refugees that lasted decades. In March of 1968, the government of Poland responded to a failed anti-Soviet revolution by purging most of Poland's meager remaining Jewish population under the guise of avenging Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. That's a whole other story that we don't have time for today, but of the 13,000 who fled, 2,700, the largest share, ended up in Sweden. In turn, the Swedish government finally ended the ban on Jews in the cabinet in 1951 and adopted Yiddish as an official minority language in 2000. In fact, Sweden is the only country in the world in which Yiddish has official status on a national level. Yet despite all of this, as well as Sweden's overall political and cultural dominance in the region, Denmark's Jewish community continued to shine brightest. Even some older Americans will know musician and comedian Victor Borge, the Great Dane who made his name on American television in the 1950s.
I have the choice of two numbers, ladies and gentlemen. One is Clair de Lune, and the other one isn't.
I don't have any deeper insight into this, I just thought it was weird and I wanted to share it. Similarly, the oldest continually operating Jewish sports team, Maccabi Helsinki. During the Second World War, British and American soldiers began forming the foundations of a permanent Jewish population in Iceland, which likely peaked in the 2010s with a population of around 250, including First Lady Dorit Musayev, and the opening of a Chabad center in 2018. That same year, Icelandic Jews and Muslims united in opposition to a law outlawing circumcision. And that's about all there is. Allegedly, the Faroe Islands are home to 12 Jews, but I couldn't find any further information. It's probably just one family. Unfortunately, it'd be impossible to talk about Scandinavian Jewry today without bringing up the steady rise of anti-Semitism in those countries over the past several decades. Though that isn't the full story. With the arguable exception of Iceland, Jewish communities in the Nordic countries have been subject to dozens of high-profile acts of anti-Semitism, to the point that in 2017, Denmark began deploying its army to guard the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen. The sources of this rising anti-Semitism have varied, from educational problems involving at-risk children of Muslim immigrants to resurgent white supremacist movements, often fueled by a certain type of immigrant from the US, and the rise and fall of the New Atheist movement, with its own overlapping history of Islamophobia. However, there's also a growing movement in Scandinavia, across ethnic, religious, and most political lines, to educate people and push back against this kind of behavior, which we can be certain isn't viewed positively by the vast majority of people in any of these countries. For the past 10 years, the Anti-Defamation League has been conducting a series of surveys to track anti-Semitic sentiment around the world. This survey has come under a fair bit of criticism for its methodology, and in large part I agree with that criticism. But I do think it's still useful for comparing countries against each other. With the exception of Sweden, this survey's definition of general anti-Semitic attitudes across the Nordic countries ranges between 10 and 16%, which is comparable to the rest of the developed world. In Sweden, however, general anti-Semitic attitudes registered at just 4%. What does this all mean? I have no idea. But before leaving you today, I want to make an extra special thanks to my viewers in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, and Åland. For some reason, people in these countries are disproportionately subscribed to history YouTubers. But today, I'm really glad you're here for me, and that your presence pushed me to make one of my longest, most challenging, and most requested videos ever. Skål. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Lederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.